Power, live from Washington, D.C.
We've certainly seen some progress from the Iranian side in the last couple of days. Again, the president has made the decision to send Stephen Jared to hear the Iranians out. And so we'll see what they have to say this weekend.
Tonight, round two, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner heading back to Pakistan to meet with Iranian officials, while Vice President J.D. Vance remains on standby stateside. The key question tonight, are both sides any closer to striking a deal?
And case closed for now. The Department of Justice drops its probe into Fed Chair Jay Powell, but leaves the door open for a future investigation as the Fed's Office of Inspector General carries out its own review. We spoke with Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, right when the news broke. That conversation in just a moment.
And Nerd Prom. Washington is captivated by the White House Correspondents' Dinner this weekend, with Donald Trump tomorrow making his first appearance as president.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And we begin our coverage tonight with the latest developments in the war with Iran as the White House dispatches special envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Pakistan for potential meetings this weekend, even as Tehran continues to sound pessimistic on the prospects of a deal, with the Strait of Hormuz still in contention. For more, we go now to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who's joining us live from the White House North Lawn. And Tyler, if the Vice President J.D. Vance is not being sent to this round, how optimistic should we be that this is actually going to result in a substantial step forward?
Hey, Kaylee, well, that's a really good point, considering, though, this White House does maintain that a diplomatic off-ramp is still a viable solution, as the White House confirms that they are going to send these two envoys to Pakistan tomorrow for a potential new round of talks. It is our understanding that Vice President J.D. Vance is essentially on standby here, and he will be deployed to the region if substantial progress is made. But we should also say that Iran has yet to confirm publicly that the country will participate in another round of talks. In fact, earlier today, we heard from Iranian state media, which is calling the foreign minister's travel to Pakistan as being part of a regional tour. But even with this said, Pakistani officials do tell Bloomberg News that they are confident that another round of talks will happen. And that would be considered progress, considering Iranian officials have repeatedly maintained that they will not resume talks until the U.S. lifts its naval blockade. And if anything, the U.S. is just doubling down as the standoff in the Strait of Hormuz worsens. You had Secretary Pete Hegseth earlier today confirming that the U.S. will be sending a second aircraft carrier strike group to help with the blockade's operations. Joe and Kaylee, as you both know, President Trump ramped up those threats yesterday, saying that he has instructed the U.S. military to shoot and kill any boats that are laying mines in the strait, as at this point that waterway remains virtually at a standstill.
Tyler, we've got to talk about the Fed with big news today. The Justice Department, of course, ending its investigation into Fed Chair Jay Powell, potentially clearing a path for his replacement, the nominee, Kevin Warsh, to be confirmed. We haven't heard from the president that I've seen on Truth Social, have we?
We haven't yet, Joe, considering that we know that this has been a big focal point of the administration. It marks a pretty stunning reversal from the Department of Justice, considering just earlier this week, the U.S. Attorney for D.C., Jeanine Pirro, had doubled down that she was going to continue to pursue this case. Now, we did hear from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, who defended this decision from the DOJ and said, if anything, there is still going to be scrutiny of the Federal Reserve.
The case is not necessarily dropped. It's just being moved over to the Inspector General, who has critical tools at their disposal to continue to look into the financial mismanagement at the Fed. This has obviously been a priority for the president. If you drive by the Fed building, the president has a point. This is a project that's been going on for a very long time. It's costing taxpayers billions of dollars, and I think it's in the best interest of the taxpayer to get to the bottom of it. So the investigation still continues. It's just under a different authority, and that's what you'll continue to see. As we've always maintained, Senator Tillis should do the right thing and move to confirm Kevin Warsh as speedily as possible. He is a phenomenal candidate to lead the Fed, and we shouldn't be holding our nation's economy hostage because of a disagreement with the Department of Justice.
Importantly, the DOJ's investigation was into allegations about whether or not Jerome Powell misled Congress in testimony about the Fed's renovations to its headquarters here in Washington. It is our understanding that the Inspector General's review, which was launched last year at the request of Jerome Powell, is just looking into those cost overruns. And Joe and Kaylee, now the big question, of course, is will this be enough to grease the skids for Kevin Warsh's nomination? I caught up with Senator Tom Tillis earlier this week on Capitol Hill, who held firm that this legal matter needed to be resolved. The question is now whether or not it will be enough, considering there is still another outstanding legal matter against another member of the Fed. That's Fed Governor Lisa Cook.
Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting live from the White House North Lawn. Tyler, thank you. It's still no statement that I have seen or that we have seen from Tom Tillis either, though we did hear from one important voice today right after that news broke this morning. With the DOJ dropping its probe into Chair Powell, we sat down with Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, who chairs the House Financial Services Committee. Listen.
Well, I think it's a good outcome. It's something that I felt should be done for a number of weeks. I said back on January 12th, I felt like the accusation that Chairman Powell had committed some sort of crime connected with the building construction or his testimony about it was a distraction, and that it would delay President Trump in the selection of a high-quality new chair for the Fed and the important economic policy that should be coordinated between the Fed, the U.S. Treasury, the legislative branch. So it's a step in the right direction. I applaud it. I hope it comes to pass, and I hope that then facilitates the prompt confirmation of Kevin Warsh.
Mr. Chairman, Jay Powell made clear that he was going to hang around as long as this investigation was underway. Now that it appears to be ending, do you expect that he will plan to leave the Fed? Well,
that's a decision Jay has to make, but I think it was clear that upon confirmation to a chair, and if there was not a continuing criminal probe, which Jay Powell certainly doesn't think was justified, and many share that view, that he would, leave the board at the end of his term. So let's see how this plays out. But the main thing I think is important is that Treasury Secretary Bessent has a good Fed chair that has the confidence of the president and who can continue to lead economic policy. And for those of us in Congress, Chairman Scott in the Senate, our Financial Services Committee in the House, we want ability to conduct oversight of the Fed, and it's very hard to do that when you don't have a permanent Senate-confirmed chair.
Well, but on that oversight idea, do you think it's right that the Fed IG is the one taking this over rather than having the Banking Committee or the Financial Services Committee in that oversight capacity taking this on?
Such a good point of view. The Fed IG is a very competent person who I think fully has the capacity to do it, and the staff and the resources. I know, speaking for myself, I was very happy to help lead an independent view by the Congress, and I can't speak for Chairman Scott, but I think he would share that view, that we're happy to conduct oversight as needed on the expense and the construction parameters around the Fed's renovations.
What's your view about what's happening with the Eccles building? We've all had work done on our homes that went way over cost and beyond the timelines. This is frequently the essence of doing really major renovations, which are happening in that case to a very old building. Do you think that there's been irresponsible behavior, or this is the cost of doing business?
I wouldn't be able to, answer that question.
Yeah.
Which is, the president's a builder. He's got strong feelings about that.
Yeah.
He went over and took a look himself. And the issue is that when you are doing construction in the District of Columbia, I can only imagine how expensive that is on permitting and required union labor and historic renovations and archaeological remains and all those costs, and the inflation that was unleashed by the Fed's own policy in 2020 and 2021, along with the rampant spending by the previous administration. So everyone, you're right, is facing, whether it's in your home or in a commercial context. But the president raised the issue of this seems disproportionately large, compared to other renovation plans that he's seen personally here in Washington, D.C. in his own experience. So it deserves explanation. The question is, did Jay Powell do something criminal about it? And I reject that point of view, I think.
Well, aside from the building itself, obviously this now leaves major monetary policy trajectory questions if Kevin Warsh is going to be taking the helm, given what we have heard from him publicly. A person who used to be quite hawkish now seems decidedly less so. He also suggested in his confirmation hearing that he would like to do away with the amount of forward guidance given by the Federal Reserve. And I wonder if you think that would be a mistake to, for example, not put out the summary of economic projections.
Well, the Fed has fine-tuned how it conducts public between post-meeting press conferences, forward guidance, the dot plots, the approved speeches that individual governors make, how many meetings a year they take. And I think it's up to the Board of Governors about that. There's no statute that says that they have
But do you think we hear from them too much? Does it tie their hands? Because that's what Kevin Warsh argues.
Right. I think that's his opinion. He's the chairman. Let's see what consensus he has. I don't know that how much I hear from the Fed determines what my opinion is about how the Fed's doing. They have 700 PhD economists. Sometimes I think the market tells them where they ought to be a lot better than some of their economic forecasts haven't been so great. But let's see how the new chair, once he's confirmed, works with his colleagues to outline what the public position will be.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes it's good to ask a community banker about his insights on these things. But the idea of a new regime, a new framework, a new approach to making interest rate decisions makes you nervous or optimistic? Is that needed?
No, I think it doesn't make me nervous at all. In fact, I asked Frank Lucas of Oklahoma to chair a special task force in this Congress to look at the past decisions by the Fed's monetary policy and the Treasury market structure. These are critical issues that we face right now. And so Frank has conducted oversight, the size of the balance sheet, the focus on the dual mandate, or should it be mostly focused on price stability? How does it interact with the banking community on liquidity? So we've actually been investigating these questions ourselves, how the district banks participate. So the fact that Kevin comes in as a former governor, having worked through the financial crisis and has his viewpoints on how the Fed should operate, I think that's healthy. I think we need rejuvenation in our institutions from time to time, and that's why we have the advise and consent confirmation process in the Senate and why these Fed chairs have a 5-year term. Not everybody can serve 4 presidents like Alan Greenspan can.
Well, of course, we're having this conversation and this potential turnover at the top of the Fed at a time where the global economy, at least a portion of it, is being held in a chokehold via the Strait of Hormuz as the U.S. is maintaining a naval blockade. Iran is still making it unsafe for commercial vessels to transit. So long as that status quo remains, as the president said yesterday, he is in no rush to solve this. He has all the time in the world. Does the economy actually have all the time in the world for this situation?
I think we're all clear that the longer the oil fuel markets are disrupted by the transit in the Gulf, we have price concerns, volatility concerns, and I'm watching that forward market in oil prices to see if they fully reflect that concern. And I do think that, if the war continues, it could be underestimated in the market. So the question will be, I think the president, though, is right to do something that we've wanted to do for 4 decades, which is end the malfeasance, murder, mayhem at the hands of the Iranians and stop their ability to have a nuclear weapon, and stop their ability to harass their neighbors all the way to Paris, France, through threats of a ballistic missile and their export of terror through their proxies. These are important goals. They're shared goals, whether people are out in the press saying they're shared goals or not. They have been long-term shared goals. And so I do commend the president for taking that action. But we do have economic risks associated with how long it's maintained. There's no doubt about that.
That was Republican Congressman French Hill of Arkansas, chair of the House Financial Services Committee, speaking with us earlier on Bloomberg. Now, optimism about the U.S. and Iran potentially returning to the negotiating table, the closing of that criminal probe into Fed Chair Jay Powell, and a blowout forecast from Intel helped drive stocks to fresh record highs today. And for all the details, we turn now to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine?
Yeah, quite astonishing, Kaylee. I mean, you go back to the end of February when the war began, and basically that set the S&P 500 on a path to 5 straight weekly losses. But basically, since the end of March, we're now sitting on 4 straight weekly gains. In fact, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, all higher than where they were before the war began, at record highs. And it's coming up for 2 big reasons. First, oil prices are still elevated, Kaylee, but they've been in sort of a tight trading range, and investors have found some degree of comfort with that. On top of that, in this still early earnings season, what we've heard from corporations has been relatively encouraging, not only just from what we've heard from some of the companies that have exposure to oil, gas, and higher energy prices, but also those companies that don't. This week, it was all about chip stocks. You saw that yesterday with that phenomenal move higher in Texas Instruments. You saw that today with a phenomenal move higher in Intel. In fact, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index on an 18-day run now. Unprecedented for that index here, and it shows you where a lot of the heads of investors are at. It's squarely focused right now on business spending, CapEx spending, and what these big cap tech companies can do for this market and potentially for this economy.
That Intel move was really something, Romaine. And so we move to more tech earnings next week. Apple, Amazon, Alphabet. What do we have in store?
Yeah, this is going to be a big one. Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, a few others that we're forgetting in there. Microsoft. These are all of the companies that are driving a lot of that big tech spending. In fact, they are a big part of the reason why Intel rallied, why Texas Instruments rallied. So their earnings reports, everyone is going to be really focusing on the CapEx spend, how much they're spending, how much they want to commit going forward. The idea that right now, Joe, this is our economy, for better or worse. It's what these companies are spending and whether they maintain that is really going to drive the market and is really going to drive the economy, and it's going to really, they're really going to have to put their cards on the table next week. I should also point out that almost all of these earnings, they actually come on Wednesday after the bell, kind of all at once. Remember, that's also Fed day here, so Wednesday is going to be a huge day here for markets. Keeping an eye on the Fed down in Washington and keeping an eye on these corporate earnings statements coming after the bell.
Great info. You couldn't have earnings reporting season without Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick. Romaine, thank you and have a great weekend.
You too.
Coming up, we'll turn our attention back to Capitol Hill on the response to the Justice Department dropping its probe into Fed Chair Jay Powell. We'll speak with Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey of Maryland. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
If we want to get Mr. Warsh confirmed, we need to drop the investigation.
For now, his positioning instincts are to stay strong, and but we'll see when it gets closer to the time. I firmly believe that having Kevin Warsh sworn in the second that Jay Powell's term expires is a first goal, and anything after that I think is secondary.
We've got a lot of Democrats on the banking committee as well. They could move to get him out of committee just as easily. And most of these Democrats have already supported Kevin when he was up for Fed governor before. So I don't think it's just Tom Tillis and his issue.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lines. And that was Republican Senators Tom Tillis, Kevin Cramer, and Bill Hagerty on the months-long DOJ investigation into Fed Chair Jay Powell, which U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro announced today she is ending, instructing the Fed's Inspector General to take it from here. But she ended her statement with a warning, writing, quote, "I will not hesitate to restart a criminal investigation should the facts warrant doing so." Joining us now with his reaction is Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey of Maryland, who serves on the House Appropriations and Ethics Committees. He's also a former prosecutor. And Congressman, thank you for joining us. It's with that prosecutor hat on that I ask you, how easy would this be to restart? How much risk could Jay Powell actually be at being prosecuted, even as a private citizen?
Well, I don't really expect this to come back because it shouldn't have come forward to start with. This was a frivolous investigation and yet another abuse of the Department of Justice by President Trump, just like with Comey and Letitia James and others. So, you know, he keeps getting slapped down with these. Hopefully he'll learn his lesson and stop bringing these. And it's really hurt the Department of Justice. I was just reading the other day that they've lost 3,300 prosecutors over there and some of the most experienced and talented ones. And they've only been able to bring in 800. So it's a huge hole. And it really undermines our ability to hold actual criminals accountable and bring them to justice. I hope he'll stop misusing the Department of Justice.
So, well, I guess in that regard, Congressman, is this a victory for justice, realizing you saw it as a corrupt case from the start? It's worked out the way it should have then, right?
Yeah, although it shouldn't have gotten started to begin with. I mean, it was clear from the beginning that he was just mad at Jay Powell and trying to find ways to force him out. All of this stuff about the cost overruns, and maybe you think they've been too high, and that's fine, but to try and lay some kind of criminal charges on Jay Powell about this was ridiculous.
Well, when we consider that Jay Powell's time as chair is likely coming to an end, Kevin Warsh at some point will be confirmed. It's just a question of when and whether we hear from Tom Tillis as to whether he's ready to cast that vote. There is a question, Congressman, as to how independent a Federal Reserve led by Warsh really will be, given the public pressure President Trump has put out there that he wants lower interest rates. Should financial markets still have confidence that the Fed will be able to operate independently under Kevin Warsh?
Well, I think there were a lot of questions that were raised during the confirmation hearing. I think Senator Warren and others, including some Republicans, actually raised questions about the independence issue and some of the statements that the president has made, essentially that he would only put somebody in place who would do his bidding. And, you know, that's one of the reasons we should have presidents who avoid making these kinds of statements. I keep hearing good things about the nominee. You hope that they're true and that he can stay true to those if he gets confirmed. You know, we're really in a delicate state right now with the economy. The Wall Street's been very exuberant, but, you know, Main Street's been really pretty disastrous for regular people. The affordability issues are weighing them down. And I think the war will continue to do that if it continues moving forward. And it looks like it will, at least for the near future. So hopefully we'll have a Federal Reserve chair that comes in and takes that into account, regardless of what the president is, you know, pressuring him to do one way or the other.
Congressman Ivey, we saw you in committee this week, House Appropriations Committee hearing with Howard Lutnick, the president's Commerce Secretary, with the idea of tariff refunds being questioned here. And we know that companies are now able to apply for refunds. The government has set up a portal to handle those requests. But there are big questions about individuals. You got into this with the secretary, and I'd love for everyone first to hear your exchange. Let's listen and we'll have you respond.
You have no idea if the administration is doing anything with respect to the refunds? You really don't?
No. As I said, there's a portal that has been put out, but it's by Customs and Border Patrol, and I'm not participating in that portal.
Okay, let's do that. How do you get the secretary to commit to following through?
Well, you cut that part off. He agreed that he would work with us to try and set up something to make it to give regular people an opportunity to get a chance to get some refunds. And it's not just individual customers too. The way they set the portal up to start with, it's brokers and the companies that were ones engaged in the actual payments of the tariffs to the federal government. Other businesses in the supply chain aren't necessarily eligible for any kind of refund. And I don't know that the portal they set up will actually accept their application. So I think we want to make sure we're doing things to help those, many of them small businesses who are not directly eligible for refunds, but especially consumers to try and do it as well. We're following up with the Department of Commerce. There are other agencies and departments in the Trump administration who are going to need to participate in this one way or the other. We had other members asking the Small Business Administration. I raised this with USTR last week. Treasury is going to have to play a role too. They're going to have a comprehensive response to this, but I think the key is to make sure that we don't rush this through, just send the dollars back to the biggest corporations and brokers, and then, let everybody else try and fend for themselves, perhaps through the court system or some other way to go about it. Let's see if we can do it right the first time and make sure the people who put money into this illegally get their refunds back.
Well, we'd like to stay in touch with you as this is sorted out, Congressman. Thanks for spending time with us this evening. Glenn Ivey, the Democrat from Maryland. It's always our pleasure on Bloomberg. Kaylee, we've got breaking news. It brings us back to the war with Iran. Yeah, from an Iranian spokesperson on a post on X says Iran has no meeting planned with the United States in Islamabad this weekend, even as the White House says they're sending Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner there with the intention of talking to the Iranians. Iran says instead its observations will be conveyed to Pakistan, who, of course, is mediating. It's never ending here. We'll keep you posted on what we learn. Coming up, President Trump indeed set to send 2 envoys to Pakistan. We'll have more next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
the president was flexible in granting an extension of the ceasefire throughout this time. The president has decided to dispatch Special Envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner back to Islamabad. The Iranians want to talk. They want to talk in person, and so the president is, as I've said many, many times to all of you, always willing to give diplomacy a chance. So Steve and Jared will be heading to Pakistan tomorrow to hear the Iranians out. We hope progress will be made, and we hope that positive developments will come from this meeting.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we did hear from the White House press secretary today, Caroline Leavitt, there on the staging for another round, potentially, of talks. Iranian officials, though, denying that any meeting has been scheduled. A spokesman saying in a post on X, no meeting planned with the U.S. in Islamabad. Observations to be conveyed to Pakistan. Joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Eric Martin. Eric, it's great to see you. Is this pre-gaming, or are we about to be stood up?
Joe, this is where we thought we were on Tuesday as well, right? We were all breathlessly waiting for the vice president to go to Andrews and to take a plane to Islamabad. And we had a step back then. Now seeing this message from press secretary and the messaging from the Iranian delegation, no, we're not going to talk to the Americans in Islamabad. I think it's really anybody's guess as to how the next 48 hours are going to unfold. The good news is that people are talking instead of bombing, right? There's this dialogue going on, whether it's in the public domain or behind closed doors, that we're seeing the two sides continuing to talk and continuing to signal that they prefer diplomacy to a return to war. But the particulars of what that looks like, who is in the room, who is traveling, who is speaking directly to whom, who is shuttling between rooms, all of that still remains pretty unclear at this point.
Well, and was it not telling that the White House specifically said J.D. Vance, the vice president, is going to be standing by in the U.S., not even trying to make the trip? Does that not indicate the White House wasn't necessarily expecting these particular talks to yield much, even if they happen at all?
Well, you know, it's quite unusual what we've seen this month in terms of the talks being led from their initiation, from the beginning, by the vice president. Obviously, in this administration, it's the president who goes and signs big agreements and celebrates breakthroughs, as he did in Sharm el-Sheikh last October with Israel and the war with Hamas and the war in Gaza. But it's unusual to have a principal like the vice president involved in the negotiations, leading him from the start. Normally, this is something that staff or lower level, mid-level officials work on, and then you bring in the vice president or the president kind of as the closer. What we've seen here is untraditional in that way, and so perhaps being able to be talking at the working level rather than the pressure of the 15 hours, which I was awake for most of them in Pakistan a couple of weeks ago. You know, we pulled an all-nighter waiting to see for the vice president to emerge in the 6 a.m. hour and tell us what had happened. So perhaps dialing that down a bit can lead to more productive discussions at a working level.
Your coverage from Islamabad was indispensable. What about the man you cover first, the Secretary of State? When does Marco Rubio get on the plane?
You know, he was involved in negotiations yesterday to reach the breakthrough for the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, to extend their ceasefire. He's obviously been, we've seen him lead on policy in Venezuela and the approach towards Cuba, and also selling the approach publicly and the strategy publicly in early March, going to the Senate and talking, briefing lawmakers, outlining for the American people, the Trump approach to Iran. And so he's been kind of playing a role, I think, more behind the scenes in a certain way, organizing the cabinet meetings and the discussions, the Situation Room. But obviously, we've seen the vice president in the public lead on these talks in particular.
Yeah.
Well, when we consider where the talks could end up, if the ultimate objective of this, Eric, is to reach some kind of new agreement that would see Iran not being able to obtain a nuclear weapon, do we see any sign that Iran is ready to yield anything, or at the very least yield more than they already did in the original Iran nuclear deal back in 2015?
We have not seen that indication yet. We have reporting. We have sources who have been telling us that the U.S. presented the idea of 20 years of no enrichment. Iran wanted 5 years. Now there may be accepting of 10. But remember, the JCPOA, the Obama-era deal, took more than 2 years to negotiate. So putting the pressure on these negotiators to essentially come up with something as strong or better in just several weeks, it's a lot of pressure. And also there's an important inspection role and monitoring role for the International Atomic Energy Agency here that we haven't seen talked about. These deals, it's a political promise that Iran would make publicly, but the deals are only as good as the monitoring and the enforcement. And so having the extraordinary, unprecedented kinds of monitoring that they had with the JCPOA, the previous deal, will be extremely important here, experts tell us, to seeing that not only does Iran commit to something, but they follow through on lack of enrichment, refraining from pursuing a weapon.
All right, Eric Martin, great stuff as always. Bloomberg's very own. Thank you so much. And in a new episode of the Michelle Hussein Show, Wendy Sherman, the former Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration, who was the lead U.S. negotiator in that 2015 Iran nuclear deal we were just discussing, had a take on Iran's new regime. Take a listen.
The regime now is more hardline than even the previous supreme leader, who was pretty hardline. And I think there's a great deal, even more control by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps than there was before. And that means that the concessions the president thinks will come easily will not come easily. They will resist. They will never, I believe, give up what they believe is their right to enrich. They may voluntarily suspend it, but they won't give up the right.
You can watch the full conversation between Wendy Sherman and Michelle Hussein on Bloomberg.com/videos or listen wherever you get your podcasts. And joining us now for more on Balance of Power is our political panel. Lester Munson is with us, Republican strategist and principal of the international practice at BGR Group, alongside Democratic strategist Megan Hayes, former special assistant to President Biden. Welcome to you both. Obviously, we're dealing with the breaking news at this time that Iran is not planning to meet with the U.S., even as the White House says the U.S. is sending envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, to Islamabad to talk to the Iranians. Would you be surprised, Megan, if that trip gets canceled? As they haven't left yet. They were set to leave tomorrow. Are they going to risk that embarrassment?
They're clearly being embarrassed now. I mean, this whole negotiation thing has been a wild embarrassment for the administration, but I do think it is important that they continue these conversations. So I hope that it doesn't get canceled, because I do think that opening up the strait and having gas prices and impact our economy is important to deal with.
Is this a wild embarrassment, or is it worth the effort to continue chasing diplomacy, even if Iran wants to at least make it appear to be standing us up at the altar?
I strongly suspect our standards for what is embarrassing have changed in the last year and a half or so. I
strongly suspect.
Truthfully, though, I don't think this is embarrassing. It is dramatic and interesting, and this could change in 3 or 4 hours or in 8 hours, and our negotiators could get there and they could find people to talk to. I think the foreign minister, the Iranian foreign minister, is actually already in Pakistan, so it does seem to be set up for further conversations. I think both sides do want to talk. They both want to resolve the Strait of Hormuz issue. To be sure, that's in Iran's long-run interests, is to resolve that question. So, yes, there's some maneuvering here, and everyone's trying to act tough and kind of puff themselves up a little bit, but they'll get to talking, I think, fairly soon.
But it's the Strait of Hormuz that seems to be the situation that is not changing whatsoever. The U.S. is maintaining the blockade, and Iran says so long as that remains the case, Iran's not letting commercial vessels through. Should we not be seeing some signs of things easing up in the Strait if we're really to believe in the idea of forward progress?
Well, I think each side wants to, objectively from the outside, each side wants to make it look like they can wait this out, that they can wait longer than the other side. I think in reality, Iran can't wait as long as the Trump administration can. I think President Trump is willing to take on embarrassment or lack of political support in polling and that kind of thing to get the long run win here. I think he's even willing to harm Republican chances in November if it gets him to a better deal with Iran at the end of the day. So he's trying to show he's got a very strong hand here. Iran does a great job of making themselves look like what they are not, and this is their last card. is the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe the Bab el-Mandeb they could hold at threat if the Houthis are a real force anymore, but probably not. This is their last card to play. They have to make it look like they can ride it out and be tough.
We wonder how much time, maybe not the president, but Republicans have politically here when you see this new poll from Rock Solutions when it comes to who blames whom on rising prices. 73% blame Trump and his administration for rising prices. 57% of Republicans included. What do Democrats do with those numbers?
Well, they need to come up with solutions on how to bring your prices down, and they need to continue to do what they're doing and pushing back on this redistricting effort, and which I think that they're doing a very good job. Leader Jeffries has really taken a stand this week in Virginia. But I just think that Donald Trump is overplaying his hand here. This was a massive miscalculation politically for them. I think that he thought that the Iranians would just give up and this would be over by now and gas prices would never have gone up. But he misjudged this entire thing. And so now we're having to do real negotiations. And the irony here is we're not going to have anything better than we already had with the JCPOA. So we're just right back where we were from his first term.
Well, as you say, President Trump thought this might be over by now. Bettors in prediction markets are less convinced that this is going to be ending anytime soon. Right now on Polymarket, just looking at the figures here, this resolving by April 30th, given 10% odds. By May 31st, 35% odds. By June 30th, 56% odds. So we get more optimistic as time goes on, but clearly people are placing bets around this conflict. That has been the case since it began. Perhaps even before it began or before specific announcements have been made. We've seen a lot of people make a lot of money, including a U.S. Special Forces member now facing criminal charges on allegations that he placed a $400,000 bet ahead of the operation he participated in to go get Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. It's becoming quite the story here in Washington, and it's one that President Trump himself commented on in the Oval Office yesterday.
It's a little like Pete Rose. Pete Rose, they kept him out of the Hall of Fame because he bet on his own team. The whole world, unfortunately, has become somewhat of a casino. And you look at what's going on all over the world, in Europe and every place they're doing these betting things. I was never much in favor of it. I don't like it conceptually, but it is what it is. No, I think that I'm not happy with any of that stuff.
The whole world has become a casino, and the idea is that there's people in the casino who may have an advantage that others don't. If you're in the White House or the administration and you have information that you can place bets on. You were inside the White House, Megyn. I wonder what you make of all of this.
I mean, the ethics and the corruption here are lacking significantly. I think that this is extremely corrupt, but isn't his son on one of the boards for one of the prediction markets? So I don't think that this is 100% not without, we could have all seen this coming, I guess, but we would have never been, this would have been completely unethical. I mean, these are some of that soldier is facing criminal charges. He's facing a lot of years in prison for this. So these things need to be regulated. They need to be taken seriously. And it's odd that Congress hasn't acted sooner before we've even gotten to this situation with prediction markets.
This story is incredible. If you haven't read this, Ken Van Dyke, a 38-year-old Special Forces soldier, Lester made 13 bets. Then he cashed out the bet, sent the proceeds to a foreign cryptocurrency vault, according to the indictment, before asking Polymarket to delete his account. This is potentially one of these bipartisan things that come along every now and then, like TikTok was for a minute, where everyone's got a bill to regulate the prediction markets. Is it smart for the president to weigh in with an investigation?
I think he should. There's probably laws on the books that have been violated here, so I'm not sure we need a new law necessarily. Okay. It's good to have some scrutiny. I actually think President Trump's statement there was pretty good. He's kind of skeptical of this whole industry. I'm very skeptical of this whole industry. At the same time, if it's done ethically, people should be free to make stupid mistakes, including betting on things where they, are probably going to lose money to the House. But this is a question. By the way, he's wrong on Pete Rose. Pete Rose should not be in the Hall of Fame. Pete Rose never expressed regret.
This should have been the
God rest his soul, but he does not belong in the Hall of Fame.
Burying the lead.
Yeah.
I don't even know how to follow that. I guess I will end with, while we're having this conversation around prediction markets and people with inside information, it all gets back to stock trading in Congress, too, right? Are we actually ever going to see that happen, Megyn? Do you believe?
Well, we should. That's the problem. I think that's probably why a lot of Americans don't trust their government, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, because stuff like this comes out and you see these people making a lot of money when they're supposed to be serving you, and they're supposed to be making laws that help protect you, and we can't even figure out how to fund DHS or to provide health care for people. I mean, that's a real problem that both Democrats and Republicans face, and it's a real trust problem.
Great panel. Lester Munson, Megan Hayes, thank you so much for the insights and the humor. I feel like he did express regret. I don't know. As we move to tonight's Power Brief, a federal appeals court has blocked the Trump administration from restricting asylum access for migrants who cross the U.S. border without authorization. U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit writing the federal immigration statute does not allow the White House to suspend migrants' rights to apply for asylum, nor allow the president to deport migrants, quote, under summary removal procedures of his own making, unquote. The ruling upholds a July 2025 district court ruling that found the president's order conflicted with federal immigration statutes.
The Food and Drug Administration announced today it's giving 3 drug makers an accelerated pathway for approval of psychedelic medications that have clinical trials underway. The FDA said the drug makers would receive national priority vouchers for studying psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder, and methadone for post-traumatic stress disorder. The move follows President Trump's executive order just last week to expedite the research and access to psychedelic medication to treat PTSD.
And consumer sentiment falling to a record low in April as concerns over the economic fallout of the war with Iran persist. The University of Michigan's final April sentiment reading collapsing to 49.8 from over 53 in March, while slightly improved from the preliminary reading. It was the lowest since 1978. Coming up, Donald Trump is set to attend his first White House Correspondents' dinner as president. What could go wrong? We'll preview the appearance coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
And Donald Trump is here. Still. Anyway.
He was laughing at that part still. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. Who could forget President Obama at the White House Correspondents' Dinner teasing now President Trump? That was back in 2015. Fast forward to this year, which will be the first time that Trump attends the dinner as president. He's boycotted it every year until now. That includes the first term. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt talked about it earlier today.
The president is very much looking forward to it. I think it's quite fitting that in our nation's 250th year, the most transparent and accessible president will be attending the White House Correspondents' Dinner for the first time. And his speech will be very entertaining. That is what I will tell you. So everyone should tune in.
Very entertaining. Joining us now as Washington stops down for what we affectionately call Nerd Prom is Bloomberg's head of media editorial, Dave Merritt, alongside Bloomberg This Weekend co-host Christina Ruffini. Clearly, everyone is in town for this event. You've come in from all over the world. Welcome. It's lovely to have both of you here at the table.
Thank you. Thank you for putting me on with the boss. No pressure
No
whatsoever.
pressure
really
at all
appreciate
here.
that.
We thought we'd just go right at it. So is this a comedy routine? He's supposedly working with comedians. We're told this could be an hour-long speech, or does he want to shame the journalists in the room? Maybe it's the same job.
I don't know. I mean, I'm surprised he is coming. Up until last week, I was texting some friends who are still here and on the board and saying, "Do you really think he's coming?" And they're like, "Yeah, he's really coming." The schedule came out last night and it said Correspondents' Dinner. So I was like, all right, well, I don't know. You know, you never quite know what you're going to get with this president. I feel like we're going to get a lecture with maybe pieces of humor.
Okay.
I don't know, but strap in, and I think we're going to be there a while.
I mean, this is the thing I think that has been so intriguing this year, is that you just don't know what you're going to get. There's this real sense of jeopardy. Is he going to lecture everyone in the room? Is he going to be rude to everyone in the room? Are people going to walk out? Is he just going to do some jokes? Is he going to go on for 3 hours and ruin the rest of everyone's evening? Because, of course, there's a lot of after parties.
That's for sure.
That people are, quite twitching to get to after several hours sitting in that room. So nobody knows. Everyone's speculating. And, these reports that he's been working with a comedian, we all know he likes to kind of make a room laugh. But this is a room of people who he's been suing some of them and has been calling them the enemy of the people. Are they going to laugh at his jokes? That's what we'll find out.
Well, that's what I want to ask you. You lead editorial for a large media organization that obviously is able to operate the way it does because of the First Amendment and freedom of the press in the United States, something that arguably this administration has gone after. Is there some irony in the idea that the press is about to gather in a room to hear the president that is
so critical of
Yeah, I think that's the nuts of the problem, the issue here as well. And you're seeing people walking around town in Washington wearing caps, with pins, celebrating the First Amendment, and they're saying it's very important to go ahead with this event. But, this event is watched all around the world. This spectacle of seeing the roasting of the president and the jokes flying and the humour of it, that doesn't happen in a lot of countries, right? So despite the attacks that have been going on in the press here, and these are very real and very serious, and the money that is being changing hands and all of these things, nevertheless, him showing up does bring everyone back to remind everyone that you have it in your constitution in the United States, freedom of speech. And that is something that is in short supply in many places still around the world.
And I will say, despite, criticism of how this president has treated the media, and I have personally been yelled at by this president, so I understand them.
That means you're winning.
Been yelled at by all presidents, so I feel like that's better. He is very accessible to the press. I mean, know this. He calls them. He talks to them. Yeah. He almost always answers a shouted question in the Oval Office spray. And having covered President Biden for 2 years, we didn't get that same level of access. So this is a president who, despite what he says about the press, does talk to the press quite frequently.
Well, the return of Trump means a couple of things. Number one, we're not going to get the typical Hollywood set, it appears. You think of the Obama dinners, and it was just you were bumping into movie stars, and they couldn't get to Washington fast enough. We won't have that. I don't know if Kid Rock's going to be there. Nicki Minaj?
Nicki Minaj is going to be there.
Yes. She's a Trump supporter.
That's big time, yes. Then there's the matter of the cutaway shot. Will reporters be caught on camera laughing at President Trump on C-SPAN or whoever's running this? Is everyone going to pretend to be serious? Because I actually believe, I'll just cast this about, that he wants to win over that room. And he wants to make you laugh, Christina Ruffini. What do you think?
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah?
I think the bosses have strategically put me in the back because I have a terrible poker face, and they don't. I don't know. It's putting folks in a very awkward situation, especially the folks on the board who fight the hardest for press freedom at the White House, who fought for the integrity of that press corps this year among changes that have made it harder to get real questions to the president when he does talk to folks. They have to sit next to someone while simultaneously giving a reporter an award for a piece that they are being, gone after by, sued for by the administration. So it's a really tough line to walk. I don't know how any of us are going to handle it.
Yeah, but it's not uncommon, isn't it? We're seeing people laugh at his press conferences the whole time.
Sure.
Right?
He cracks jokes frequently.
Juxtaposed against some very serious stuff. Let's not forget, we're in the middle of a war with Iran. The context of, the geopolitical context here is very serious. So again, there's questions being asked about the appropriateness of a comedy routine. Last year, the president declined to come, and the comedian was cancelled, right? It was a bit more of a somber affair, and everyone was saying this is not a moment
so we've got a mentalist.
Yes.
The mentalist,
this year. You've got him on tomorrow, right? Is that true?
We did. We no longer do.
I didn't mean it. Well,
we no longer do.
Did he teleport the cancellation to you, or how did that?
He had something else to do.
What are we doing with a mentalist on stage?
I don't know. I think it's to David's point. They just the comedian just didn't feel right, but they also wanted it to be entertaining. So I think they went with this.
I had the feedback from last year. They
needed something to zhuzh it up a bit. This dinner, it has gotten to a point where there are very serious questions, even by people who love this dinner, about the relevance and the appropriateness of this event as a whole. Look, I am one who will support going to dinners with people you cover, treating them as humans, getting to know your sources as human beings outside of work. But again, the optics here, given everything we've talked about, are just really tough. And is this something that we should all continue to put this much effort into?
This wouldn't be scandalous in the UK, right?
Oh, no. No, I mean,
hang out with your sources.
I think hanging out, I think you take the lobby in Downing Street, which is the body of journalists, and I think, the connective tissue there between people who may criticise each other in public, but behind the scenes spend a bit more time socially. That's possibly a little bit more of a norm there. But I would say the other big thing here in Washington this week, it's not just about that dinner, it's everything that's going on around.
Always.
And, it doesn't take much to persuade all these journalists to come into town for all these parties at the embassies and, thrown by corporates with free bars. And it's just a great way to network beyond that actual dinner in the room.
All right,
I have a feeling Dave and Christina are hitting up some parties as this show ends. David Merritt, Christina Ruffini, thank you so much. Enjoy the weekend. You can catch Christina tomorrow morning on Bloomberg This Weekend, starting at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. And, of course, a brand new Wall Street Week with Bloomberg's David Weston is coming up next on Bloomberg TV and Radio.